I know I just put a warning at the beginning, but I'm being so serious that I quite literally spilled my guts out in this one, so if I get any TMI comments, it's honestly your fault at this point. Alright, now that I've covered that, I got a very specific comment where the beginning says, I think it's very weird how people on one hand say that minors are inherently incapable of consenting to sex, that a child being sexualized is unacceptable, and that if a minor has sex with an adult, it is the worst and most traumatic crime imaginable. But on the other hand, they say, here, take all the condoms you want and you are completely free to do whatever freaky thing you want with anyone in any circumstance, as long as they are also minors. Suddenly, you can consent and it is good to be sexualized and doesn't affect your psychological development. I think the logical way is to choose one or the other. You can't have your cake and eat it too. This comment was in response to a poll where I asked people how they felt about middle school and high schools giving away free condoms in sex ed classes, since I found that a lot of people have mixed feelings when it comes to sex ed and minors. This commenter goes on to talk about later about how they feel about the condom thing later, but I think this beginning part is just based on a misunderstanding when people say it's normal for teenagers to be sexually curious and experiment with their peers, and also adults shouldn't sexually take advantage of minors, because both are generally true. But I think they fail to understand why teenagers can engage with intercourse with another age-appropriate consenting teenager, but not with a fully grown adult, even if the adult and minor are both consenting. If you don't know, it basically comes down to developmental science. The brain regions that are tied to impulse control and decision-making keep maturing into the early mid-20s. I've heard people say that your prefrontal cortex fully develops at 25, but that's not really true, considering that everyone's brain is a little different because we've all had different upbringings and just lived experiences, and our brains are constantly changing as we grow older anyway. But despite the amount of nuance there, it is still true that younger people typically still have less developed executive control systems, even if each individual younger person has had completely different lives from the next. Which is why I believe that no prepubescent children can truly consent, even if it's with another prepubescent child. They can experience curiosity, imitate things they've seen, and they can engage in exploratory play, but consent requires understanding what you're agreeing to. If you don't have the developmental capacity to understand what the act is, you cannot meaningfully consent to it regardless of whether either party initiated it or seemed willing. But when those prepubescent kids become teenagers, it is factually different. I understand that there are going to be a lot of people who don't understand because they think all minors are undisclosed asexuals until they turn 18, and then it's free reign. But puberty brings out not just physical changes, but a neurological reorganization that includes the emergence of genuine sexual desire, again, if the child didn't actually turn out to be ace. Before puberty, children can imitate sexual behavior, but aren't experiencing it in the same way. After puberty, teenagers are experiencing actual desire, attraction, and physical response. But, as I said before, puberty doesn't close the developmental gap between a teenager and an adult. Like if a 15-year-old tries to get with like a 20-year-old, even though the 15-year-old verbally says that they want to be with them, there's still a power imbalance. Even if there was a hypothetical scenario of a 20-year-old being held back in school and had similar amount of past experiences or something, because ages do in fact matter. The typical adult has more developed impulse control, life experience, social power, and the neurological capacity to recognize and exploit vulnerability in ways that typical teenagers simply cannot match or defend against. The issue isn't whether a teenager can say yes or not, it is more based on the conditions exist for a no to be equally possible, and with an adult, they almost never are. The way that this commenter framed what they were saying came off as though they see consent in a very binary way, but just because we as a society supposedly don't allow minor ex-adult relationships doesn't mean that pubescent minors can't have relationships at all, even if they're sexual. I think recognizing that teenagers have developing sexuality that deserves honest education and harm reduction is not the same as saying teenagers have identical consent capacity to adults in all contexts. They also start talking about how it's crazy that people will pretend that having access to contraceptives is harm reduction, because in reality it's actually just actively normalizes the behavior. And the cultural narratives around it encourages children to pursue this idea of serial dating, casual sex, and pornography. That is a very big jump to get to that conclusion, especially considering the fact that even teenagers who have little to no access to sex education get even more teenage pregnancies in cases. The countries with the most comprehensive sex education and the easiest access to contraception consistently show lower rates of teenage pregnancies, lower rates of STIs, and lower rates of sexual violence compared to countries where sex education is abstinence only or absent entirely. If access to contraception normalized risky sexual behavior, you'd expect the opposite data, but the real data doesn't support that sort of conclusion. But to give this person the benefit of the doubt, they might also be talking about a hypothetical version of bad sex education that teaches you how to have sex and enter in porn sites in the search bar, and that's it. But comprehensive real sex education does not promote pornography. In fact, it actually typically includes media literacy components that critically examine how pornography misrepresents sex. Near the end of their comment, they also bring up a pretty quick but a bit vague strawman that people freak when religious parents deter their kids from having sex and end up calling those parents abusive. But again, I truly believe that this person is just conflating the two different kinds of people again. There's a significant difference between parents who teach values around sex and parents who use shame, punishment, and information deprivation as control mechanisms. And both of these kinds of parents can either be religious or non-religious. Like, believe it or not, but religion is not the threshold of who's a bad person or not. The kind of parenting that causes actual documented psychological damage are ones that remove safety from the relationship entirely, which is abusive. Again, I'm not trying to say that every single religious value should not be taught to kids, because you can still express why you support those values and propose those values to your kids without being a neglectful about it. I saw this video where this very obviously Christian mother was explaining her daughter why people wait until marriage and why she wants that for her daughter. Very typical talk of basically it's a very close activity, and when you're that close and vulnerable with someone, you'd want to make sure they're the right ones. Maybe certain people could argue that it's a bit weird to have that sort of conversation with your kids since waiting till marriage is mostly about preference, but this Christian mother also makes a big point about how even if her daughter decides that she doesn't want to wait and something happens, she makes sure that her daughter knows that it's safe to go to her and that she will still love her and help her with whatever she needs in that moment. It is not abusive to advise your kid against sex, but it is abusive that if you teach your kid that if they don't wait, they lose access to you as their guardian. If her daughter chose not to wait and the mother decides to say something like, "How could you let this happen? You're sleeping with demons, you're letting Satan corrupt you," that could be considered a rupture in their attachment relationship. What the mother in the video was doing is called unconditional positive regard, which means communicating to your child that your love and availability is not contingent on their choices. She shared her values, which is her right as a parent, but she explicitly decoupled those values from her daughter's access to her support, which is very sophisticated and mature parenting. That is something that a lot of parents unfortunately don't do, because then they just don't understand that the child then begins to register the parent as an unsafe attachment figure, meaning that once a caregiver is coded as unsafe, the child stops bringing them real information that a parent would really need to know, not because they're being sneaky or rebellious, but because their brain has quite literally learned that honesty with this person produces pain. So they protect themselves the only way available to them, which is silence. And sometimes that silence is taught. Despite the amount of times that I've said that teens having sex is pretty normal and healthy if it's consensual with someone you actually like and they like you and they're also age appropriate, I also feel like I need to say that it's perfectly normal to also not have as a teenager too. I know that there are plenty of people who had no problem not having sex when they were minors, but I also know that a lot of teenagers, when actually presented with an opportunity, find that their actual desired response to be a lot more harder to execute. I said before that my parents did a great job not exposing me to anything non-kid friendly during my childhood, and while that was true, I learned about non-kid friendly things from my peers who didn't have the most innocent and educational intent when it came to teaching me about those things. The way my parents taught me about consent in sexual context was basically just say no if anybody touches you, which is fair, but that also contradicted the lesson that they really shoved down my throat, that being polite is more important than being comfortable. A prominent example would be like, I remember one of my parents throwing fits at me when I was younger because I didn't want to eat at other people's houses because I was a picky eater. So they would try to force me to eat, but I'd end up gagging on the food, so my parents would get pissed at me for embarrassing them. And if I looked at this from my parents' old school perspective, I get it. One of the biggest ways that people express their appreciation for each other is by making them food. So I can imagine a child scoffing and gagging at basically someone else's love language is frustrating and frankly embarrassing. But I'm just saying that even in this context, my parents' response to that situation shaped my subconscious understanding of when it's not acceptable to say no. I ended up telling myself that when someone offers me something as an expression of care or desire, rejection is rudeness. My discomfort is less important than their feelings received. To say no is to embarrass myself and the people responsible for me. The appropriate response to someone's wanting is gracious acceptance even when my body is rejecting it. And I know that some people might say that it's a stretch to say that that connects to sexual consent because it's not even touching. And it's not a bad thing to make your kid eat things that are good for them and also happen to make others happy. So you might be surprised at the fact that their response was pretty much the same when it came to touching too. I talked about it a little bit in my consent video, but I said that some older lady who was the girlfriend of my family friend was rubbing my thigh and also touched my chest while me and my family were all riding in a car. When I expressed my discomfort verbally with just don't don't touch me, I don't like it when people touch me. My parent got annoyed with me. I didn't express this in that video, but after I said that in the moment, my parent jokingly said that I was just a teenage brat who didn't listen to anybody, basically so the family friend's girlfriend wouldn't feel so offended. On paper, to what people tell you to do in a situation where someone is touching you without your consent, I did everything I was supposed to do. I expressed my discomfort, I removed myself as best as I could by moving my leg and pushing her hand away, and held my ground by continuously saying to stop touching me because she didn't listen to me the first time. Those are all things that consent education tells you to do, but instead, I got met with my parents' face. The one that your parent puts on that you can immediately tell that you did something wrong, and that to me was unfair. And again, you might say that my parents' response still doesn't connect to sexual consent because it's true that I wasn't in any real danger. I was right next to my parents. Nothing that bad besides the apparently subjective weird touching could have actually happened in that moment. So you might again be surprised that they also didn't seem to bat an eye when I told them that a trusted adult was texting me. I did sports when I was a little kid, like every little kid, and I admired this one instructor a lot. One random day, they somehow got my phone number when I became a teenager, and they were in their 20s or something, and they would text me first every single day just checking in on me. Textbook grooming, by the way, but I didn't know that, and I don't know if they knew that either. But I always felt safe with them. They were the coolest person I'd ever seen in my life. They were funny, athletic, good looking, and I was their favorite student. So the day they asked me to send naked photos of myself, my teenage self was now presented with a situation. Someone I loved, admired, and trusted with my entire being is expressing their desire for me. And from what I've learned, making my loved ones happy by giving them what they want, especially if it's not so burdensome for me, should have a better outcome than being scolded for being impolite, right? But afterwards, all they said was that it was a mistake and that they wanted to go back to how it was. And I was so mad. In the moment as a teenager, I understood that scenario as rejection, not as a quick correction of asking a minor for news as an adult, but as I mentioned, my parents were also really old school, so they didn't really consider that a kid could get groomed through the digital space by an adult they trusted, because it's not like they touched me or even had the opportunity to kidnap me, but in reality, they still groomed me through those texts, whether or not they knew that's what it was called. And when they made their request, it came through a screen, which creates a specific kind of distance that makes it easier to comply and harder to process what's actually happening in real time. Online and digital context remove most of the cues that might otherwise signal discomfort, like body language, hesitation, and the look on someone's face, which means the person asking doesn't get the same feedback they would in person, and the person being asked doesn't get the same sense of presence and reality that might help them trigger their own instincts. For teenagers especially, a lot of sexual pressure now happens in digital spaces through unsolicited images, requests over DMs, and even sometimes pressure in group chats. And that permeance of digital content adds a layer that doesn't exist in physical interaction because now there's proof of what happened, which can also mean blackmail, which is such a specific kind of vulnerability that no one is really adequately preparing teenagers or even parents for. People tend to have this very specific picture in our heads of what vulnerability looks like when someone is in danger or being harmed, especially people who follow old school morals. So when the reality doesn't match that picture, people don't always update their understanding of what happened. They just decide that what happened wasn't that serious, which means the gap between what people imagine harm looks like and what harm actually looks like in real life is where a lot of people fall through, and where a lot of people are left to figure out things entirely on their own. And when young people, especially teenagers, are left to figure things out entirely on their own, sometimes their body and mind unconsciously internalizes lessons that nobody meant to teach them. When I ended up telling people who believed that they did everything they could to teach me to be a decent person that I had gotten by an 18-year-old when I was 15, their initial response was, "How could you let this happen?" I mean, honestly, right? How could I? I honestly don't remember the physical feeling, which thank God, but I do remember the TV I was staring at and the feeling that I needed to stay quiet because one of my friends, who was also 15 at the time, was sleeping next to me. I thought about leaving this part out since I know that if I publicize something like this and explicitly name it, I'm going to get the same response of, "It's your fault, you should have done something different." But I think those responses are because of how uncommon my kind of response is brought up when talking about consent. There was a long time where I didn't consider it SA because there was a lot of people in my life who told me that it wasn't, and I would get genuinely upset when people called it SA because the hardest part about dealing with my specific assault was people's doubtful responses to it, and for some reason it was just easier for me to let people believe that I was just a sick perverted freak who had sex next to their friend while they were unaware than to go through the charade of answering a bunch of stupid questions like, "Well, are you a perfect victim? No. Well, it's not actually right? But years later, I've come to understand that I simply had a very common psychological response that I had no more conscious control over than a knee-jerk reflex. Freezing is actually the most common response to sexual assault, like even more so than fighting and more common than running, because when the brain registers a threat but determines that fighting or fleeing aren't viable options because maybe making noise feels more psychologically dangerous than staying still, it shifts into a third mode of waiting, just enough to protect your consciousness from what's happening to get you through it. There is a bigger gap than you'd think between cognitive awareness and behavioral response. A teenager can know in some part of themselves that they don't want something and still be completely unable to say so in the moment. And it really shouldn't be treated as a weakness or stupidity, because that's just what happens when you've been conditioned your entire life to prioritize other people's comfort over your own. The reason freeze responses are so misunderstood is that we've built our entire cultural image of assault around resistance. We picture screaming, struggling, running, and when someone's experience doesn't mirror those, like if they stayed quiet and didn't physically fight back, people fill in that gap with the worst possible interpretation, that is, that they wanted it. But I really hope that we can all understand that stillness and a limp body is not consent. About a year later, actually apologized to me, and they told me that they were just so crossfaded and didn't realize that I didn't actually want it, which is interesting to think about now because I've been 18 before, and I remember rejecting a 17-year-old coworker because I felt like they were too young, in the sense that they were still in high school and I had already graduated, and I didn't really develop a relationship with them while we were both in high school, so it just felt too predatory to me. They just wanted the excitement of doing it with someone that was nice to them and gave them advice a lot, and that didn't feel like genuine consent to me. I understand that a lot of 18-year-olds probably don't think about it like that because they're also still young, but I'm just saying that, well, I thought you wanted it is not really a valid excuse at all, especially since in my case, they didn't even ask. There is a difference between fault and responsibility. A teenager who took what they thought was a yes at face value may not be at fault, but they can still take responsibility for building more awareness going forward. In my specific example, it's fair to say that the 18-year-old may not have been fully aware in the moment because he was under the influence, which speaks to a fault. But they were old enough to not get that impaired in a situation with a younger person, because even before that even happened, they had begged my best friend, who was also 15 at the time, to sleep over because he got kicked out of their house. They wanted to be there. They expected something, and I probably wasn't the intended target because my best friend got mad at somebody that night, I can't remember, and locked herself in her room. They may carry less moral fault than someone who acted with full conscious awareness to what they were doing, but their responsibility is still higher than a teenager who simply mistakenly took being awake as a yes, because they created the circumstances. The impairment doesn't erase that. If anything, choosing to get that impaired after literally begging for a sleepover situation with 3 15-year-olds is itself part of the responsibility. But let's just give them the benefit of the doubt, since maybe they forgot to ask, or maybe they're one of those people who thinks that asking directly kills the mood. Sex has an enormous amount of cultural narrative attached to it about who you become by having it. A teenager pursuing sex is sometimes pursuing something that they believe that sex will deliver, which could mean that a teenager's implication or verbal yes might actually not be a direct yes to the physical act with that specific person. Most people, not just teenagers, don't have fully internal sense of what they want. They have the sense of what gets them approved of, what fits the role they're playing, and what the people they're currently trying to impress expect of them, and they experience that as wanting. Sometimes the teenager who proposes they don't actually want isn't lying, but they genuinely can't always distinguish between I want this and I want the version of myself that does this and or gets the reaction I'm imagining. I kept seeing a couple of people on social media describe this as also SA because internally you didn't really want it, but that's not what makes SA so terrible. Sexual assault, whether that just be inappropriate touching or straight up rape, requires that something was done to you without your consent, or that your capacity to consent was compromised by force, manipulation, intoxication, or power imbalance. But if the other person was being considerate by asking initially and offering you ways out, or at least checking in on you during, and you end up saying yes, this is fine at every single checkpoint, even if you know that you knew deep down that you didn't actually want it, it's still not SA. But it is something sexually abnormal, which is called compliant sexual behavior, which basically means that you consented and participated, but your underlying motivation was relational rather than sexual. It's still recognized as a real and distinct experience that can carry its own emotional weight, mild regret, or confusion, but it sits in a completely completely different category from violation. Some people retroactively label experiences like that as SA because they've learned that not enthusiastically wanting it equals assault. I understand that people are trying to be well-meaning when saying stuff like this, but it unintentionally creates a binary where you either never have a choice or always have a choice, and can follow through with what you actually want. The therapeutic concern with compliant sexual behavior isn't that harm was done by the other person, it's more about what it reveals about the person's relationship with their own desire and self-worth at the time, such as the pattern of outsourcing decisions about your own body to what you thought someone else wanted. It's definitely worth understanding about yourself, but understanding it doesn't mean that you're a victim to the other person who genuinely didn't know and tried their best to make you feel comfortable. I'm not trying to infantilize anyone, including teenagers, because they can make informed decisions for themselves and be responsible, because sexuality by itself exists on a spectrum. Even before that incident happened when I was 15, I had already previously participated in intercourse with someone who was actually age appropriate and was also very considerate about how I was feeling. And I personally don't really regret doing that sort of thing, even if I was younger than the average age, because I truly believe that the teenagers who consciously and fully choose to have sex should be able to by having access to the accurate information that makes their experience as best as it could be for both parties, both physically and mentally. It is very hard to navigate consent, especially when consent applies to other areas other than sexual interactions, and it's also very difficult to explain to someone so young who probably also don't want to talk about it the differences between why you can't say no to cleaning up their room because people are coming over, but you can say no if those people try to touch you while they're here. What actually distinguishes those categories is something most parents never articulate explicitly, which is the difference between who the decision serves and whether it causes harm. Sexual consent for minors is still very complicated, a lot more complicated than it already is for adults, because at least for adults the rules are not too young, not too dead, not too not human, and make sure they're consenting, while minors get not too young, not too old, not too dead, and not too not human, and make sure they're consenting but also make sure you're consenting. And what's sad about that is that a lot of adults can't even figure out most of the 4 basic rules that they have. So I find it very comforting when I see so many parents and professionals acknowledging the things that they are lacking in consent education and decide to act on it by teaching their young kids to look out for freeze responses, to honor others and their own no's, and that it's also okay to change your mind mid-yes, because that is not radical, that is not encouraging anyone to have sex. It's just making sure that the minors who are already in those situations have something more useful than no means no and yes means yes. But I don't know, that's just me. Laters.